Sir, you're not allowed in this seat. Move immediately.
I told you already, this is my seat.
You need to stand up right now so we can verify your ticket.
I paid for this seat weeks ago. I'm not going anywhere.
What's happening? Sir, stand up now!
Let go, you have no authority over me.
Oh my
Are they
God.
serious?
I warned you, you're coming with us!
This is outrageous.
The moment it started, nobody in the cabin spoke. Not because they didn't want to, but because the scene unfolding in front of them made absolutely no sense. First class on Flight 278 was supposed to be the quietest part of the aircraft. Wide leather seats, warm overhead lighting, polished armrests, and the low hum of passengers settling in before departure. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun reflected across the runway while ground crews moved equipment away from the aircraft. It was the part of the plane where people usually relaxed. Business travelers checked emails. Couples sipped pre-flight drinks. Someone a few rows back quietly flipped through a magazine. And in seat 2A sat a man who looked exactly like someone who belonged there. He wore a tailored dark suit, sitting comfortably with one arm resting on the armrest, while the other held a boarding pass loosely between his fingers. His carry-on bag was tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of him. But there was one thing about him that seemed to be drawing more attention than the seat itself. He was the only black passenger in the first-class cabin. At first, the looks were subtle. A glance from across the aisle, a quiet whisper between two passengers a few rows behind him. Then one woman leaned toward the flight attendant standing nearby and said something under her breath. The flight attendant frowned slightly, nodding once before walking toward the front of the aircraft. A few minutes passed. Passengers continued boarding. Then the mood of the cabin shifted instantly when two uniformed airport police officers stepped onto the plane. Their presence alone made people look up. The officers moved down the narrow aisle slowly, scanning the rows until they reached the front section. Then they stopped, directly beside seat 2A. The lead officer looked down at the man sitting there. "Sir," he said firmly, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "we've had a complaint." The businessman looked up calmly. "You're not supposed to be sitting here." For a moment, the words hung in the air. Several passengers turned in their seats. The man glanced down at the boarding pass in his hand before raising it slightly so the officer could see it. "This is my assigned seat." The officer barely looked at it. Instead, he shifted his stance, in resting one hand near his belt while his partner stepped closer behind him. "First class is restricted," the officer replied. "You need to move to the back." A ripple of curiosity moved through the nearby seats. Across the aisle, a passenger leaned forward slightly. 2 rows behind them, someone quietly lifted a phone. The man in seat 2A didn't move. He remained seated, meeting the officer's eyes without raising his voice. "I'm not moving," he said calmly. "Check the passenger list." That single sentence changed the energy in the cabin. Passengers began whispering again. A man near the window muttered something to the woman beside him. The flight attendant near the galley watched the exchange carefully, her expression uncertain. The second officer stepped closer into the aisle, narrowing the space around the seat. You're delaying boarding," the first officer said, his tone sharper now. "Stand up." The businessman slowly lowered the boarding pass back into his lap. His jaw tightened slightly. "You're making a serious mistake." Several passengers were openly watching now. The officer's patience was clearly running out. He leaned slightly closer to the seated man. "Stand up and step out of the seat." But the man didn't stand. He didn't even shift in the chair. Instead, he calmly adjusted the boarding pass in his hand. And for the first time, the officer glanced down long enough to read the name printed across the ticket. Marcus Ellison. The officer didn't react. Not yet. Because at that moment, the name on that boarding pass didn't mean anything to him. But within the next 20 minutes, that name was going to turn this quiet first-class cabin into the center of a mistake that would leave everyone on that plane stunned. Before we rewind and show you how this confrontation started, something quick. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories where abuse of power eventually collides with the truth, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Now, to understand how two officers ended up standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin trying to remove a passenger from his seat, we have to go back about 20 minutes earlier. Because none of this started with Marcus Ellison. It started with a complaint. About 20 minutes earlier, the mood inside Flight 278 had been completely different. Boarding had just begun, and the first-class cabin was filling slowly with passengers stepping in from the jet bridge. Flight attendants moved calmly through the aisle, greeting travelers, checking seat numbers, and helping store carry-on bags in the overhead compartments. It was the usual rhythm of a routine departure. Marcus Ellison had boarded early. He stepped into the cabin without drawing attention to himself, greeting the flight attendant with a polite nod before checking the seat number printed on his boarding pass, 2A. The seat sat near the front window, one of the wider first-class spots with extra legroom and a clear view of the wing outside. Marcus slid his bag beneath the seat, adjusted his jacket, and sat down. Like most business travelers, he immediately opened his phone. Scrolling briefly through a few messages before placing it face down on the armrest. Nothing about the moment stood out. But the passenger who boarded the plane just a few minutes later noticed him immediately. A woman in her late 50s stepped into the first-class cabin, pulling a small rolling suitcase behind her. Her eyes scanned the seats as she looked for her row, then they stopped, right on Marcus. She paused in the aisle for a moment longer than necessary. At first it seemed like confusion, but then she glanced down at her boarding pass again, then back at Marcus. Her expression tightened. Without saying anything, she continued past him toward the rear of the first-class section, where her seat was located. But she didn't sit down right away. Instead, she leaned slightly toward the flight attendant standing nearby and spoke in a voice low enough that most passengers couldn't hear. Marcus didn't catch the exact words, but he noticed the way the flight attendant's expression changed. At first, the attendant simply smiled politely, nodding the way airline staff often do when listening to passenger requests. Then the woman leaned closer and repeated something again. This time, the attendant's smile faded. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Marcus in seat 2A, then back to the woman speaking. The conversation lasted only a few seconds, but when it ended, the flight attendant nodded once more and quietly walked toward the front of the aircraft. Marcus didn't think much of it. Complaints happened on flights all the time. Seat confusion, overhead bin space, passengers wanting to switch rows. It was rarely anything serious. Meanwhile, the woman who had raised the concern sat down in her seat but continued glancing toward the front of the cabin. Every so often, her eyes landed on Marcus again. Around them, the rest of the boarding process continued normally. Passengers shuffled through the aisle. A man in a navy blazer placed his suitcase in the overhead bin above row 3. Two travelers across the aisle discussed a connecting flight. But the flight attendant who had spoken with the woman earlier hadn't forgotten the conversation. She walked toward the front galley where another crew member stood preparing pre-departure drinks. The attendant leaned in slightly and spoke quietly. Within seconds, the second attendant looked toward seat 2A. Both of them did. They neither spoke for a moment. Then the second attendant picked up a small tablet used by the airline crew to monitor the passenger manifest. She tapped the screen a few times, scrolling down the list of names assigned to first-class seats. Her finger stopped. Row 2. Seat A. She stared at the screen for a moment longer. Then she looked up toward Marcus again. From a distance, everything appeared completely normal. Marcus sat quietly in his seat, occasionally glancing at his phone. No raised voice, no suspicious movement, no sign of conflict, but whatever had been said by the passenger earlier had clearly planted doubt in someone's mind. The second flight attendant hesitated before handing the tablet back. "Maybe we should have someone check," she said quietly. The first attendant nodded. And neither of them wanted to escalate the situation unnecessarily, but airline protocol was strict about seating assignments in premium cabins. If a passenger was sitting in the wrong seat, It had to be corrected before takeoff. The problem was neither attendant had actually spoken to Marcus yet. Neither had asked to see his boarding pass. Instead, the concern had already begun traveling up the chain. Within a few minutes, the issue reached a gate supervisor standing near the aircraft door. The supervisor listened briefly, glanced toward the cabin, and frowned. Then he reached for the radio clipped to his belt. What happened next would set off a chain of events no one on that plane expected, because instead of simply walking onto the aircraft to verify the seat assignment himself, the supervisor made a decision. A decision that would bring airport police directly into the first-class cabin. And within minutes, 2 officers were walking down the aisle toward seat 2A, toward Marcus Ellison, and toward the moment that would turn a quiet boarding process into a public confrontation that none of them were prepared for. The call went out quietly. Most passengers boarding Flight 278 never heard it. Near the gate desk, the supervisor had stepped slightly away from the crowd, lifting the small radio clip to his belt and speaking in a calm, routine tone. To him, it was just another situation that needed to be handled quickly before departure. But the decision he made in that moment would change the entire atmosphere inside the aircraft. Instead of walking down the jet bridge himself to verify the complaint, the supervisor chose the faster option. Yet he called airport police. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers appeared at the gate. They weren't rushing. Their pace was steady, controlled, the kind of movement that made people instinctively step aside without being asked. The supervisor gave them a short explanation. A passenger in first class might not be in the correct seat. Someone had complained. There had been a refusal to move. It sounded simple enough. The officers nodded, thanked the supervisor, and turned toward the jet bridge. From the outside, the aircraft looked completely ordinary. Passengers were still boarding. The gate scanner beeped every few seconds as boarding passes were scanned. But inside the cabin, the tension that had started with a quiet complaint was slowly beginning to build. Marcus Ellison still sat in seat 2A, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place outside the aircraft door. He had returned to scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing up as other passengers walked past his seat. A few of them looked at him briefly before continuing down the aisle. 1 or 2 looked longer than necessary. Marcus noticed it but said nothing. Traveling frequently had taught him something important about airports and airplanes. Sometimes people simply stared. He had learned not to react. At the rear of the first-class section, the woman who had made the original complaint noticed something else. The moment the 2 officers stepped onto the jet bridge, she leaned slightly toward the aisle, trying to see past the other passengers. And when the officers entered the plane, her expression changed almost immediately. Across the cabin, and the 2 flight attendants also noticed them. One of them straightened slightly, watching as the officers moved down the aisle toward the front of the plane. Passengers turned their heads one by one as the uniforms passed by. Police rarely boarded planes before departure. When they did, people noticed. The officers moved with quiet confidence, scanning the rows until they reached the first-class section. Then they slowed. The lead officer glanced briefly toward the flight attendant standing nearby. She hesitated, then subtly nodded toward seat 2A. The officer followed her line of sight. Marcus Ellison, still seated, still calm, still holding the same boarding pass. The officer stepped forward. His partner positioned himself slightly behind him, narrowing the space in the aisle. And several nearby passengers straightened in their seats, suddenly aware that something serious might be about to happen. The lead officer spoke first. "Sir," he said firmly. Marcus looked up. "We've received a report that you're occupying a seat that isn't assigned to you." Marcus blinked once, clearly confused by the statement. Then he lifted the boarding pass slightly. "This is my assigned seat." The officer didn't reach for the ticket. Instead, he folded his arms slightly and glanced around the cabin. A few passengers were already watching closely. "You'll need to stand up and move to the back of the aircraft," the officer said. Marcus stayed seated. "I'm not moving," he replied calmly. "You can check the manifest." The officer's posture stiffened slightly. In his experience, most situations like this ended quickly. See, passengers usually stood up the moment police arrived. Compliance was expected. But the man sitting in front of him showed no sign of getting up. Behind the officer, his partner shifted slightly, blocking part of the aisle. More passengers were watching now. A man across the aisle slowly lifted his phone. The lead officer's voice grew firmer. "Sir, you're delaying boarding." Marcus placed the boarding pass back in his lap. His expression remained calm, but his eyes hardened slightly. "You're making a mistake." For a brief moment, neither man moved. The cabin felt smaller now, tighter. Every passenger nearby sensed the tension growing between the two men standing in the aisle and the one sitting calmly in seat 2A. What the officers saw in that moment was a passenger refusing a lawful instruction. What Marcus saw was something very different. And within the next few minutes, that difference in perspective would push the situation from a simple seating dispute into a confrontation that would soon involve the entire plane. By the time the officer repeated his instruction, the calm rhythm of boarding had completely disappeared from the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been focused on their phones or conversations were now openly watching the confrontation in the aisle. It was impossible not to. Two uniformed officers were standing directly over a seated passenger, and the tension between them was beginning to ripple through the surrounding rows. The lead officer shifted his stance slightly, making it clear that he expected the situation to end quickly. "Sir," he said again, more firmly this time, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Stand up and move to the back of the aircraft." Marcus Ellison didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply remained seated. His hands rested calmly on the armrests, the boarding pass still lying across his lap. "I'm in my assigned seat," he said evenly. "You can confirm that with the passenger list." The officer's jaw tightened. From his perspective, the situation had already gone further than it should have. Passengers who belonged in first class rarely caused scenes like this. And when police became involved, most people stood up immediately to avoid escalating the situation. But the man sitting in front of him hadn't moved at all. Behind the officers, several passengers had started whispering. Across the aisle, a man leaned slightly toward the woman sitting next to him. "Oh, why is he refusing?" he murmured. 2 rows behind them, another passenger had already raised his phone higher, holding it discreetly at chest level as the camera recorded the unfolding scene. Near the galley, the flight attendant who had spoken to the complaining passenger earlier stood frozen, watching the exchange with growing concern. She had expected the officers to verify the boarding pass and clear up the misunderstanding. Instead, the confrontation seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. The second officer stepped closer now, narrowing the aisle even further. "Sir," the first officer said sharply, "you're delaying this flight." Marcus looked up at him again. "I've done nothing wrong," he replied calmly. The officer glanced briefly toward the nearby passengers who were watching. Then he leaned forward slightly, but lowering his voice just enough that the tension in the moment became unmistakable. "Stand up," he said. Marcus didn't move. Around them, the whispers grew louder. Some passengers looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. But a few were watching with expressions that carried something else. Quiet judgment. To them, the situation seemed simple. A man refusing to follow instructions from police. What they didn't know was that Marcus had already shown his boarding pass once, and no one had bothered to actually look at it. Across the aisle, the man filming with his phone shifted slightly to get a clearer view. Another passenger further back raised her phone as well. The moment was no longer private. The confrontation had turned into a spectacle. The officer straightened again, clearly losing patience. "This is your final warning," he said firmly. Stand up and move to the back." Marcus slowly picked up the boarding pass again. He held it between his fingers for a moment, as if debating whether it was even worth showing a second time. Then he looked directly at the officer. "You're making a serious mistake." The words hung in the air. For a brief second, no one spoke. Then the second officer reached forward slightly, positioning himself closer to Marcus's seat. The movement was subtle, but everyone in the nearby rows saw it, and they knew exactly what it meant. The officers had already decided what was going to happen next. What they didn't realize yet was that someone behind them had just begun checking the passenger manifest again. And the name listed next to seat 2A was about to raise questions no one in that cabin was prepared to answer. By now, the tension inside the first-class cabin had reached a point where no one could pretend it was just a simple misunderstanding anymore. Boarding had slowed almost to a stop. Passengers stepping onto the plane were pausing near the entrance, noticing the two officers standing in the aisle and the cluster of people watching from their seats. The quiet luxury atmosphere that usually defined first class had been replaced by something else entirely: curiosity, discomfort, and the unmistakable feeling that a scene was unfolding. Marcus Ellison still hadn't moved. He sat in seat 2A exactly the way he had before the officers arrived, his posture calm, his movements controlled. The boarding pass remained in his hand, resting against his lap, as if he already knew it was the simplest piece of proof in the entire situation. But proof only worked if someone was willing to look at it. And the officers standing over him had already decided the situation was something else. The lead officer glanced briefly toward the front of the aircraft, where the jet bridge connected to the door. Passengers were beginning to gather there, trying to understand why boarding had slowed down. Then he turned his attention back to Marcus. "Sir," he said sharply, "this flight cannot depart until this situation is resolved." Marcus nodded slightly. "I agree," he replied. The calm response only seemed to irritate the officer further. "You're refusing to follow a lawful instruction," the officer continued. "That makes this a different situation." Behind him, so his partner stepped closer again, positioning himself partially between Marcus and the aisle. The message was clear. The option of simply walking away from the confrontation was disappearing. A man sitting across the aisle leaned forward slightly, whispering to the passenger beside him. "This is getting serious," he muttered. 2 rows back, the passenger who had started recording earlier now held his phone openly in front of him. The camera lens pointed directly at the officers and the seated businessman. Other passengers noticed and began lifting their own phones. The confrontation was no longer just a disagreement. It had become something people wanted to document. Near the galley, the flight attendant who had spoken to the complaining passenger earlier shifted nervously, and she had already mentioned the situation to another crew member, who was now quietly scrolling through the passenger manifest again on the airline tablet. The screen glowed softly as rows of names moved past: seat numbers, ticket classes, passenger details. The crew member paused briefly when she reached row 2, but before she could say anything, the lead officer spoke again. "This is your last chance," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Stand up and move to the back of the aircraft, or we'll remove you ourselves." A few passengers gasped quietly at the word remove. Marcus didn't react. He simply placed the boarding pass down on the armrest beside him and folded his hands together. Then he looked directly at the officer standing over him. "You're making a mistake you're going to regret," he said calmly. For a moment, the officer didn't respond. The confidence in Marcus's voice wasn't what he expected from someone who was about to be escorted off a plane. Behind him, his partner shifted again, clearly preparing for the possibility of physical removal. The passengers filming leaned forward slightly. Everyone in the surrounding rows could feel that the situation was about to cross another line. What none of the officers realized yet was that the crew member holding the tablet behind them had just stopped scrolling through the passenger list, and the name displayed next to seat 2A had made her sit up straighter. Because suddenly, the situation didn't look like a passenger sitting in the wrong seat anymore. It looked like something much bigger, and someone important was about to find out. By now, the quiet tension inside the cabin had hardened into something much heavier. What had started as a disagreement about a seat had turned into a full confrontation between authority and resistance, played out in front of dozens of watching passengers. The lead officer had already made up his mind. From where he stood, the situation was simple. A passenger was refusing to comply, and the longer the man remained seated, the more it made the officers look like they had lost control of the situation. That wasn't something they were willing to allow. The officer took one step closer to Marcus's seat. "Sir," he said, his voice now louder, sharper. "You've been given multiple instructions. Stand up now." Marcus looked up at him. The calm expression on his face hadn't changed once since the officers arrived. But now there was something else behind it, a quiet certainty. "I've shown my boarding pass," Marcus said evenly. "You can check the manifest." The officer shook his head slightly. That's not the issue anymore. Around them, passengers leaned forward in their seats. Several phones were now clearly recording. Across the aisle, a woman whispered to her husband, "Why won't they just look at the ticket?" But the officers weren't listening to the passengers. The second officer reached toward Marcus's armrest. "Stand up," he repeated. Marcus didn't move. For a moment, the cabin fell silent. Then the lead officer made a decision. "All right," he said coldly. "If you're not getting up on your own, we'll help you." A few passengers gasped quietly. The second officer grabbed Marcus's arm. It happened quickly. Too quickly. Marcus remained seated for only a second before the officers pulled him forward, forcing him up from the seat. The sudden movement caused the nearby passengers to shift in alarm. Someone near the back of first class muttered, "This is ridiculous." Phones lifted higher. The moment was now fully on camera. Marcus didn't struggle, but his voice carried clearly through the cabin. "I paid for this seat," he said calmly. "You're making a mistake." The officers ignored him. They turned him toward the aisle. From behind them, the flight attendant holding the tablet stepped forward suddenly. "Officers," she started. But the lead officer raised a hand without even turning around. "Ma'am, step back." She hesitated. Her eyes moved between the officers and the tablet in her hands. The name on the screen was still visible. Seat 2A, and Marcus Ellison, and the notes attached to the booking. Her expression changed. But by the time she spoke again, the officers had already started pulling Marcus toward the front of the cabin. Passengers moved their legs out of the aisle as the group passed. Some looked shocked, others looked uncomfortable, and a few simply kept filming, because moments like this had a way of spreading far beyond the place where they happened. As the officers reached the front of the aircraft, Marcus stopped walking, not resisting, just stopping. He turned his head slightly toward them. "You really should check that manifest," he said calmly. The officers didn't respond. Behind them, the flight attendant finally found her voice. "Officer, wait." Her tone had changed. This time it carried urgency. But the officers had already opened the aircraft door. And the moment Marcus stepped into the jet bridge, someone from the airline operations office was already moving quickly down the corridor toward them. Because the name connected to seat 2A had just triggered a call that was about to change everything. The moment Marcus Ellison was pulled into the jet bridge, the situation should have been over. From the officer's perspective, it already was. They had removed the uncooperative passenger, cleared the aisle, and restored order to the boarding process. Inside the cabin, passengers were still buzzing with quiet conversation as the aircraft door remained open. But outside the plane, the situation was shifting in a way none of the officers could yet see. Marcus stood calmly between the two officers in the narrow jet bridge corridor. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't arguing. He simply watched them with the same controlled patience he had shown the entire time. Behind them, the flight attendant who had been holding the airline tablet stepped through the aircraft door. "Officer, wait," she said again. Her voice was firmer now. The lead officer turned, clearly irritated. "Ma'am, we're handling it," he replied. The passenger refused to follow instructions. But the flight attendant wasn't looking at Marcus anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the tablet screen. "Did either of you verify his boarding pass?" she asked. The officer frowned. "That's not the issue. It actually is," she interrupted quietly. For the first time since the confrontation began, the officer hesitated. The flight attendant turned the tablet around so the screen faced them. Displayed clearly at the top of the manifest was the name connected to Seat 2A Marcus Ellison. Below it, several notes were attached to the booking: corporate priority passenger, board advisory status, ownership tier shareholder. The officer's expression shifted slightly, but before he could say anything, another voice came from further down the jet bridge. "Excuse me?" Everyone turned. A man in a dark airline operations jacket was walking quickly toward them, holding a phone in his hand. He stopped a few feet away and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Ellison?" he asked carefully. Marcus nodded once. The operations manager glanced briefly at the officer standing beside him. Then he took a slow breath. "I just received a call from headquarters," he said. The officers exchanged a quick look. "What's going on?" the lead officer asked. The operations manager hesitated for half a second. Then he said the words that instantly changed the air in the jet bridge. "Mr. Ellison is not just a passenger." The officers looked back at Marcus. For the first time since the confrontation began, the situation felt uncertain. The operations manager continued. "He's the airline's largest individual shareholder." Silence fell over the corridor. The officers blinked. Inside the plane, passengers near the door were still watching through the open entryway. Phones were still recording. The flight attendant slowly lowered the tablet. Marcus adjusted his jacket slightly. His voice was calm, the same calm he had carried since the very beginning. I told you," he said quietly. "You should have checked the manifest." The realization spread across the officers' faces almost instantly. What they had believed was a simple seat dispute had just turned into something far more serious. And everyone watching inside that aircraft had just witnessed the moment the power in the situation completely flipped. If you've ever seen a moment where someone in power pushed too far and instantly regretted it, let me know in the comments. And if you want more real stories where arrogance meets accountability, make sure you subscribe. Because what happened next on that jet bridge didn't end with this reveal. In fact, for the two officers standing there, the real consequences were only just beginning. For several seconds after the words left the operations manager's mouth, no one in the jet bridge spoke. The narrow corridor that had just moments earlier been filled with authority and urgency now felt strangely still. The two officers standing beside Marcus Ellison looked at each other briefly, as if silently checking whether they had heard the same thing. Largest shareholder. The phrase didn't fit the version of events they had been operating under. From the moment they stepped onto the aircraft, the narrative had seemed straightforward. A passenger refusing to move from a seat he wasn't entitled to. But now the foundation of that assumption had cracked wide open. The operations manager took another step forward. His expression had shifted from confusion to careful professionalism. "Mr. Ellison," he said, lowering his voice slightly. I sincerely apologize for the situation." Inside the aircraft doorway behind them, several passengers had leaned forward in their seats, trying to hear what was being said. Some were still recording, and the whispering inside the cabin had begun again. The lead officer cleared his throat. "Hold on," he said, turning toward the operations manager. Are you saying this passenger actually belongs in that seat? The operations manager didn't hesitate. Yes, he replied. Then he gestured toward the tablet still in the flight attendant's hands. Seat 2A. Confirmed first-class boarding priority. The words landed heavily. The second officer shifted uncomfortably. For the first time since the confrontation began, the confidence in his posture was gone. Marcus remained exactly where he was, calm, composed, watching. No, the operations manager continued carefully. Mr. Ellison sits on the airline's advisory board and holds the largest individual block of company shares outside the executive leadership group. The explanation was quiet, but the meaning behind it echoed loudly in the jet bridge. The lead officer's eyes flicked back toward Marcus. In that moment, the imbalance of the entire encounter became painfully clear. They hadn't just removed a passenger, they had publicly dragged one of the most powerful stakeholders in the entire airline out of his own seat. Behind them, the flight attendant spoke softly. Passengers inside the cabin recorded most of the incident. The officers didn't respond, but both of them understood what that meant. Inside the plane, the passenger standing near the doorway was already whispering to someone on the phone. Yeah, he said quietly. They dragged him out of first class. Turns out he owns a huge part of the airline. The story was already moving. The operations manager turned back to Marcus. Sir, he said respectfully, we'd like to escort you back to your seat. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he glanced briefly toward the officers. There was no anger in his face, just a calm that felt even heavier now than it had earlier. I tried to show them my boarding pass, he said simply. Neither officer replied. The operations manager stepped aside slightly, creating a clear path back toward the aircraft door. Inside the cabin, passengers were now openly watching the jet bridge. Phones were still raised, waiting. Marcus adjusted his jacket once more and began walking back toward the plane. And as he stepped through the doorway, every person in first class suddenly realized the man they had just watched being dragged out of his seat was actually one of the most powerful people connected to the airline. But the humiliation he had just endured in front of an entire cabin full of witnesses was only the beginning. Because what happened next wouldn't stay inside that airplane for long. When Marcus Ellison stepped back onto the aircraft, the entire first-class cabin fell quiet. Only minutes earlier, those same passengers had watched him being pulled from his seat by two officers who believed he didn't belong there. Now he was walking calmly back down the aisle, escorted not by police, but by the airline's operations manager. The difference in energy was immediate. Passengers who had been whispering moments ago now sat silently, their attention fixed on the man returning to seat 2A. Several phones were still raised, recording, documenting, because everyone in the cabin understood something important had just happened. The flight attendant, who had originally been trying to resolve the situation, stood near the galley, visibly relieved but still shaken. As Marcus reached his seat, the operations manager stopped beside him. Mr. Ellison, he said carefully, again, I want to personally apologize for what happened. Marcus placed his boarding pass back on the armrest and looked toward the front of the cabin. For a moment, he didn't respond. The quiet stretched long enough that the passengers nearby leaned slightly closer, in waiting to hear what he might say. Finally, Marcus sat down. The same seat he had been dragged out of minutes earlier, seat 2A. He adjusted his jacket calmly and then looked up at the operations manager. Thank you, he said evenly. The operations manager nodded respectfully before stepping back toward the front of the aircraft. Behind him, the two officers remained standing in the jet bridge doorway. Neither of them had re-entered the cabin, and the reason was obvious. Passengers had recorded the entire confrontation, the removal, the accusations, the moment Marcus warned them they were making a mistake. The lead officer glanced down the aisle toward seat 2A. The situation had shifted beyond his control. Inside the plane, a passenger in the second row leaned toward the man beside him. That video is going everywhere," he whispered. And he was right. Because within minutes, clips from multiple angles were already beginning to circulate. Passengers were uploading footage, posting descriptions, sharing the moment when a black businessman was dragged out of first class, despite calmly showing proof that the seat belonged to him. But the most powerful part of the story hadn't even surfaced yet. The detail that would make the incident explode online was only just starting to appear in those posts. Marcus Ellison wasn't just a passenger. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was the airline's largest shareholder, the person whose investment helped keep the entire company running. And he had just been publicly humiliated on one of their own flights. By the time the aircraft door finally closed, and the first wave of reaction had already started, passengers were still whispering, phones were still buzzing, and somewhere outside that plane, executives inside the airline's headquarters were already beginning to see the same videos spreading across their screens. Because what had happened in that first-class cabin was no longer just an onboard incident. It had become a public story. And when the aircraft landed later that day, the fallout waiting on the ground would be impossible for anyone involved to ignore. By the time the flight finally landed, the story had already traveled far beyond the aircraft cabin. Passengers who had recorded the confrontation wasted no time uploading their footage. Multiple angles, multiple voices, every moment of the encounter, the officer's commands. Marcus Ellison calmly showing his boarding pass, the moment he was pulled from his seat, and the quiet warning he gave them before everything changed. "You're making a serious mistake." Within hours, the clips began circulating across social media platforms. What started as a short video quickly turned into a viral conversation. People were asking the same questions again and again. Why didn't the officers check the boarding pass? Why was the passenger assumed to be in the wrong so quickly? And why did the situation escalate so aggressively before anyone verified the basic facts? Then the second part of the story surfaced. The detail that turned the incident into something much bigger. Marcus Ellison wasn't just a passenger removed from first class. He was the airline's largest individual shareholder, one of the most powerful investors connected to the company itself. The reaction online intensified almost immediately. Commentators began breaking down the video frame by frame. Passengers who had been on the flight added their own accounts of what happened inside the cabin. Several described the tension, the whispers, the moment the officers decided to remove him without verifying the manifest. Within 24 hours, the airline released an official statement. They confirmed that an internal review had been launched. Executives described the situation as deeply concerning and acknowledged that the passenger involved was, in fact, a major stakeholder in the company. The officers involved were placed under immediate review, and according to early reports, the airline had already begun discussing new protocols to prevent similar incidents from happening again. But for many people watching the story unfold online, the real issue wasn't just the procedural mistake. It was the assumption that started the entire chain of events. The quiet belief that someone like Marcus Ellison didn't belong in a first-class seat. Back inside that aircraft cabin earlier that day, passengers had watched the situation unfold in real time. They had seen a calm passenger repeatedly offer proof. They had seen officers refuse to verify it. And they had seen the moment when authority collided with the truth. Marcus himself never raised his voice, never argued, never lost control of the moment. Instead, he simply told them to check the manifest. And in the end, the manifest told the entire story. Because sometimes the biggest mistakes don't happen because someone breaks the rules. They happen because someone assumes they already know who belongs where. And on that flight, 2 officers learned that lesson the hardest possible way. If you had been sitting on that flight watching this unfold, what would you have thought in that moment? Do you think situations like this happen because of bad judgment, hidden bias, or something deeper inside the system? Share your thoughts below. I read the comments and I want to hear your perspective. And if you believe stories like this matter because they hold power accountable, consider subscribing and sharing this video. Because sometimes the most important stories aren't just about what happened, they're about making sure it never happens the same way again.